folks. Welcome back for another Feature Friday. I'm your host, Ryan Glover, and this week we're going to be learning about building an upvote system. So one of the features that's going to be available inside of Command, the first SaaS that's coming from Clever Beagle, is an upvotes feature on the different ideas that you have for your product. So one of the problems that I constantly have when I'm trying to decide what the next direction to take a product is well, what's actually going to be popular with customers. And if you're running your own product or if you've run a product before, you're probably familiar with the problem that not a lot of customers are vocal. And so sometimes it can be hard to get feedback on things that you're thinking about building, but you're not sure if they're really going to deliver the value that your customers are looking for. So what we're going to do is look at the upvotes feature inside of Command, and I'm going to walk you through how I built it and why I built it that way, and hopefully you can take this and use it to build your own upvotes feature in your own product. So if you're ready, let's get started. One of the problems that I consistently have when I'm working on products is knowing what to build next. And I found that getting feedback from customers is extremely difficult. You can do things like surveys, and you can do things like actually scheduling meetings one-on-one with folks, and those do work, but it adds a lot of friction to the process for something very simple, which is figuring out where you should move next. And so one of the things that I'm building into Command to make that process a little bit easier is the idea of upvoting. So everybody's familiar with upvoting or liking or adding some sort of emoji reaction to something. It's very low friction from the customer's side. It's very easy to say, yes, I like this, or no, I don't. And it gives us just a kind of a pat on the back as developers to say, okay, I can kind of see what's more important to customers or what's more popular with customers without having to deal with a lot of back and forth. And so the feature that's being added and that we're going to learn how to build today, so the feature that's being added to Command is upvoting. So here we can see the view card modal that pops up. So these are cards. These are the different ways that you can track your work inside of Command. And there are 5 different types. So there's features, chores, refactors, bugs, and ideas. And so the idea is that when you create a new card, you're going to have the option to enable voting on the card. So that way you can share the link out for your card with your customers, or you could share it to prospective users if you're not quite launched yet or you're not in beta yet. And just quickly get feedback on something that you're thinking about building or that you're in the process of building. So that way you can kind of gauge, oh, okay, this is a good idea, or that didn't pan out so well. So what we're going to look at is this button right here. So this is the upvote button. Very simple. There's not a lot of thinking going into this. It's literally you click it and it adds 1. You click it again, it removes your vote. Simple as that. And so what I want to do is show you how I went about building this. So if we jump over to the code, I've got the view card modal component that's rendering this. So this whole modal thing right here, I've got that whole component's code pulled up. And what we can see is I've got this one line to render this component. And what I'm saying is if the data for this component, so in this case we're loading the current card, so whatever card we've clicked on back here, so if I click on this, or this, that data represents the card. So if I click back here, this is our card, and I'm saying if that card has its allow public voting property set to true, I want to render the votes component. And so you may have seen this before, but if not, essentially what that's doing is streamlining or simplifying a ternary operator. So technically we could also do this inside of React, but what's neat is this achieves the exact same thing. So we're saying if this is true and this exists, render this or return whatever this is. So in this case, we're returning a component, so it's going to render that if allow public voting is true. Really neat way to do that. So if we take a look at the votes component, and again, the votes component is literally just this button. There's nothing else to it. So if we jump into that component, what we're going to see is pretty much what we'd expect. There's not a lot going on, but the way that it does work is pretty neat. So if we look down here in the render function, we can see we have our button, and here I'm using styled components. So again, Command is being built with PUP, so all the same tooling that's publicly available to you MIT license free on GitHub. That's what I'm using to build command with. So there's nothing really that new here in terms of parts. I'm just using the existing stuff that's already available and putting it together into a product. Partially to show you that you can build a pretty serious product using PUP, but also just because it was kind of designed on purpose to make my life a little bit easier when I'm building my own stuff and working with mentorship customers at Clever Beagle. So style components are the CSS framework of choice. So what I mean by that is we can see up here I'm importing styled votes from a .styles file inside of the votes component directory, and this is located in the UI components directory. So UI components votes, and then we've got index.js, which is the component code, and we've got our styles inside of styles.js. So inside of styles.js, I've just got this one style component. You can see I'm just doing a default export for this. And basic CSS here. There's not too much crazy going on. The fanciest thing here, I would say, is this box shadow. So all I'm doing is adding a little bit of a box shadow to make the button look like it's floating, and then when you click it, the shadow goes away to make it look like you've pressed it in. So that's a nice little effect that's pretty cheap to do. You just put a, oh goodness, there's no way I'm going to remember the exact position here, but I think this is your X value, your Y value. This is like your feather amount, like the amount that it blurs out, and then this is the sharpness of it or something like that. Somebody's probably going to send me hate mail because of that, because that's definitely not right. But this is getting this effect that you see here. So if you want to add something like that in your own UI, that's how you do it. And then here I'm saying take the RGB code for black. So 000 is black, and then the A here stands for alpha or opacity. So this is saying lower the opacity to 0.03%. So that gets it so that it technically is black, but it looks like a very light, kind of glowing gray color that comes out. Aside from that, there's really not much in here. I've got the icon for the up arrow in there, and then I've got a paragraph tag to display the number of votes that are currently present for this card. So if we jump back to that component, what we're going to see is the loading of the data for the votes, or loading the actual votes, is pretty simple. So has voted is a prop that's placed on that component, and if we look back in our styles, oh, that's why I'm getting confused. It got drug all the way to the end. I'm sitting here wondering, like, am I a crazy person? I am a crazy person, but not because of that, because of many other reasons. So we've got the has voted prop on our styled votes component. So if I go up to styles here, what we're looking for, there it is. So when somebody has already voted, and what I mean by that is when they've done that. So we'll notice that the color of the arrow and the text turns to blue. So using styled components, what I'm doing is I'm saying if props has voted is true. So here we're actually using a ternary operator instead of the and trick before, because we are trying to flip between two values. So we're saying if somebody has voted, we want the color of the icon to be var primary. So var primary is a CSS variable that's inside of the CSS framework that I'm using to build command with, called Fur, which is another project from Clever Beagle that's going to be coming out later this year. And that's essentially Clever Beagle's response to something like Bootstrap, or what are the other big ones? You've got Material UI, one of those. So it's just a CSS framework to style your project with, and primary is one of the colors, and that color is blue. So what we're saying here is when props has voted is true, we want to set the color to blue, and when it's not, we want to set it to black. Simple as that. And then same thing with the paragraph tag. If you voted, we want the text to be blue. If you haven't voted, we want it to be black. Easy as that. Everything else here is just kind of circumstantial based on how I did the design. There's nothing really that special about it. So you can really style your own vote component or vote button however you'd like. It doesn't really matter that much, but that's the internals of that. So what we can see here is that if .data or data.loading is not true, so this, when we put the bang in front of data.loading, or the exclamation point, in front of data.loading, what we're saying is if data.loading is false, meaning it's not loading, we actually do have data, we're going to use that and trick again, and we're going to say go ahead and render a paragraph tag. This time we've got something a little funkier inside, so we're using a ternary operator again. So we're saying if this is true, do this, else or otherwise do this. But what we're doing is probably a little bit of hubris on my part, but you know, everybody's got a dream. So what I'm saying here is take data.votes.count and tell us, is it greater than or equal to 10,000? So the idea here is that this button is going to display so many votes, and I realized that, like, you know what, if for some reason somebody uses this and it ends up being a really popular feature or whatever they're talking about and it gets a ton of votes, that's going to get a little weird looking. It's not going to look right. So just to have some fun, what I did is I said, okay, if the number of votes is greater than or equal to 10,000, just automatically shorten the text to 10K plus. Because at that point it's kind of negligent. You kind of know that people want this thing if you're getting 10,000 votes on it. So I figured, hey, let's just go ahead and shorten that to 10K plus. And then after the else here, what we're saying is data.votes.count, or literally render the exact number of votes. So up to 10,000, you're going to have that number rendered. So we could have a maximum of 9,999 is going to be visible, but the second somebody votes it to 10,000, then we're just going to see 10K plus. So that's about it in terms of what we're rendering. And if we look here, we've got an onClick handler also on this component, which is pointing to this.handleVote. And that is a function on the votes component, which is saying when somebody clicks on it, we want to trigger the vote mutation. Now, you may be thinking, what do you mean by vote mutation? So what I mean by that is, because I'm using pup, I'm also taking advantage of GraphQL to do the data for this product. So if we go down to the bottom of our component, what we're going to notice is when I export the component, I don't just export it by itself. So you may be used to seeing things like this. So just export the component name directly. But what I'm doing is I'm wrapping that component with a method or a function, I guess you call this a higher order component, called compose. And inside of that, I'm passing two other higher order components called GraphQL. And the idea here is that compose and GraphQL are coming from the React Apollo package. So internally inside of pup, I use Apollo to communicate with our GraphQL server. And so Apollo is responsible for both making requests to the GraphQL server as well as retrieving those requests in the data that they send us and storing it in a client-side cache or a browser-side cache for us. And so what we're doing down here is we're saying, when you mount this component, go ahead and wrap it with the GraphQL container containing the votes query. And we're going to look at that specifically, but the votes query is literally go and tell us how many votes this card has. And we can tell that's kind of what's going on because we see votes query here, and then variables we're passing the card ID. So here card ID is coming from card ID right here. So this is back in the view card modal component. So we're saying card ID equals data.card ID. So whatever card we've clicked on back here in the UI, we're going to get that card's ID passed down as a prop. And then back inside of our component, we can see that we've got access to the props that are passed to that component via the options callback function that's given to us by the GraphQL higher order component. Now, admittedly, first few times that's a bit of a doozy, so if that didn't really make sense to you, the best way you're going to learn it is to keep following along with this video, but also rewind a little bit and listen to me very slowly, kind of like, I forget what YouTube lets you do, but you can slow it down by like, I think it's like 0.5x, just kind of listen to me talk like this and explain it, because that will help you to understand it. It's really not too crazy what it's doing, but it is a lot of moving parts when you're just getting familiar with it. So here we again have the votes query, and we're passing in the card ID as a variable, and we'll see how that actually makes its way up to the server in a bit. And then we also have another GraphQL higher order component loading a vote mutation. And now mutations in GraphQL, if you're not familiar with those, are responsible for doing the actual data mutations or data updates in our application. So that would be the C, U, and D of CRUD. So the R is read in CRUD, so create, read, update, delete, whereas mutations are the CUD, so create, update, delete. That took me a second, I had to think that one through. So the create, update, and delete. So in this case, when we say vote, we literally mean, hey, register a vote for what is going to be the current user on this card ID. And again, we're passing in the card ID that we're getting via the props. And one more time, this is coming from right here. So this card ID passed via props is being made accessible here in the GraphQL higher order component to us in the options callback function. And then we can pass that as part of the variables that go to the actual mutation, or up here to the actual query. So what's neat about this is that when these complete, so when the component is loaded into memory is the best way to think about it, by the time we get it, that's where things like data are coming from. So right here, this votes query, once this is done doing its work and it's performed the query and we've gotten a response from the GraphQL server, what we're going to get back is a data prop assigned to the component that we're wrapping. So literally by virtue of having this GraphQL higher order component, when all is said and done, it's going to pass data down as a prop to votes containing the data that we requested. So in this case, if we look, we see data is the prop, but then we're calling to data.vote. And if we look at the query, so here I've got a file called votes.gql. And so votes.gql is in a directory called queries that's very close to our component inside of the UI directory. So our votes component is in UI/components/votes/index.js. And then our queries are stored in a separate file, simply because they can get a bit squirrely sometimes. So the pattern in PUP is to separate your data queries and your mutations as well from your components. So I've got UI components are the actual components themselves, but then we have UI queries, which is for the R, the reading data, and then we have UI mutations for all the mutations, or the CUD, create, update, delete operations. So here what we've got is the query definition for reading votes from the server. So what we're saying is we take in an argument, or a variable in this case, called card ID. And again, this card ID that you see here is mapping back to the card ID that we see here. So if I change this to pizza, I would change this to pizza. And so if we come back, let's make sure we don't ask for pizza, even though that sounds kind of delicious. What we're going to say is card ID, we're taking a card ID, and we're using the scalar type ID from GraphQL. So scalar types are, I want to say it's a handful of common types. So you have things like strings, booleans, integers, floats, and you also have custom types. We'll look at those in a little bit. A bunch of stuff, but ID is one of the built-in scalar types that you get. And as far as GraphQL is concerned, that's saying that you're passing me a string that is meant to be not human readable. So it's just a unique identifier for whatever this data is. And that's one of the conventions of GraphQL. So what that's doing is it's allowing us to very explicitly state, here's the type of data that we're passing to you, or that we intend to pass to you. So then GraphQL, and we'll see this in a little bit, GraphQL is going to check that against what it has on the schema that's attached to our GraphQL server, and it's going to say, do those two match up, and does it meet expectations? If it does, continue forward. If it doesn't, throw an error. So here we're saying define the variable card ID and then pass it to our actual query. So we're saying the votes field. So inside of GraphQL schemas, you have a concept of fields that you can query. So the votes field is responsible for returning us votes on a given card. So in this case, the votes on the card ID that we're passing as our variable. So again, all the way back here, whatever card we've clicked on, that card ID here is the same as card ID here is the same as card ID for these two lines. So we're just passing that along. And so what we're doing here is we're saying, hey GraphQL server, go ahead and give us all of the vote data for this card ID, and when you send that back, send it back with a count and whether or not the current user has voted. So count is going to be an integer number, so that's going to be anywhere from 1 to, like we saw, whatever it is. So we cut it off at 9999, but it could be 500,000, who knows. But we want to get a count back of how many votes we have, and then we also need a Boolean, true or false, to say, okay, has the current user voted, because that tells us how to display our UI back to that user. So if they voted, remember, we want to turn our icon to be blue. So in this case, I've voted. In this case, I haven't voted. So current user has voted is going to tell us whether or not we need to turn that to be blue. So we've got our query here, and we've loaded it into our component here. So the idea is that as soon as this component loads, this query is going to execute. And again, once it gets its response, it's going to pass it as the data prop, and then on that data prop we'll have votes. So votes here is matching the name of the field that we're querying. So just like we saw before, so if I change this to pizza, I could say data.pizza here. So that's where that naming convention is coming from. That's not arbitrary. So now that we kind of understand, okay, this is how data is flowing into the component and this is how it's rendered and styled up, what we don't really know is what happens on the server side, or more specifically in the GraphQL schema side of this. So what I want to do is go and look at the server next. So we're going to see what happens when we actually go to vote. Before we do though, I want to explain this final step here. So on click, we're saying this.handle vote. So remember, we get data automatically, but we haven't talked about where the mutation comes in. So the mutation in this case is, again, we call to GraphQL, passing our mutation, and what we get when all is said and done is a mutation function with the name that we pass here. So I'm calling it vote. So quite literally, vote here, or whatever is returned from this GraphQL higher order component is a better way to say that. Vote here then is equal to vote here, and you can see I'm pulling vote off of this.props for the votes component. So just like we saw with data for our query, when we load a mutation using the GraphQL higher order component, that mutation is passed as whatever name we give here as an option. So we're saying vote. So again, we'll bust out the pizza again. So I could call that pizza, and then up here I could say pizza, and then our function that we would call is literally pizza. So that's how that is flowing into the component. So yeah, change that back. Okay, so what we want to do here is we're saying, well, in order to execute or invoke our mutation, what we're doing is saying call the mutation function that we get, passing in variables. So you'll notice this pattern again and again and again with GraphQL is in order to pass some data to the server, and that is both for querying data. So like we saw down here, if you're querying or requesting data or reading data, you're going to need to pass a variables object with any variables that are utilized by your query. The same exact thing applies to your mutations. So if you need to send some data along with your mutation, so if you're saying, hey, I want to update some data in my database with some data from the client, that data from the client is going to go inside of this variables object. This could be arbitrary. So this could be, oh, I don't know, maybe you had an input for typing in a username, or you had we'll just say it's a sign-up form. So you could add username and password. Whatever data you have on the given page or in the given component, you can pass it there as a variable to your GraphQL mutation. And just like we saw with queries, if we open up votes GQL from our mutations directory. So again, we have UI mutations and we have UI queries. So earlier we looked at UI queries and then we looked at votes GQL inside of there. Now I'm looking at UI mutations / votes.gql. And the pattern is going to look very, very similar. So just like we saw before, we take in a variable called card ID, and just like we saw before, pizza could go in here. We could name it pizza and reference that back in our component. But the idea is that we're going to pass along a card ID and then vote here. So make sure you pay attention. So this is vote singular, whereas this was votes plural. So what we mean by that is votes is saying give me the votes, and this is saying perform the action of voting. I want to vote on this card ID. So again, we pass card ID as our variable, and then right here we expect the exact same return value that we got back from our votes query. So over here we said once we get a response back, we expect it to have account and current user has voted Boolean or true false. And then over here we're saying the exact same thing. And in this case, I don't really utilize this inside of the votes component. We're going to use a different mechanism for making sure that the user has voted or checking if the user has voted. But as far as GraphQL is concerned, you do have to explicitly pass some sort of return value when you perform a query or a mutation. There's no way around that. So I'm just going to say, hey, go ahead and give me back the exact same data that I had before. No harm, no foul. So if we go back to our votes component, again, we're saying call the vote function, passing in our card ID variable, which is mapping up to this. And then we're saying one other thing, and this is a very neat trick when it comes to working with GraphQL. So we've got this extra option here that we're passing to our objects. We've got variables as a property on our options object, and then we have refetch queries. So what we're literally saying with this is after this mutation has completed, go ahead and perform these queries or refetch these queries. And if we look, what we're saying is we want to refetch the query votes query with the variable's card ID. So quite literally, this chunk of code right here, though it may not look like it, is doing the exact same thing that this code is doing. The only difference is that this one is being performed when this component is originally loaded, and up here we're saying do this after our mutation is completed. So refetch this query after our mutation has completed. And so the idea here is that once our mutation is complete, we expect the data in our database to have changed. And so if we refetch the data relative to what we were mutating, so we're thinking, okay, we want to get the votes back from the database for the card that the user just voted on or is trying to vote on. And so when they actually do place their vote, whether that be voting it up or maybe they're unvoting because they made a mistake or they changed their mind, when they're doing that action, after it's complete, go back and get the data. And so what is going to happen is we're going to refetch this query, and this is a convention of Apollo. This isn't necessarily a GraphQL convention. This is something that Apollo, which again is the client-side framework that we're using to help us to actually perform our queries and mutations, but also to cache our data. And that cache data part is important. So when we say refetch queries, we're essentially saying, hey, Apollo, go get the data and update your client-side cache. And so what that's going to do is make sure that whatever we just did on the server in terms of our votes is going to be cached locally in Apollo's cache. So that's not something we directly see, though if we do open up, so I'm going to inspect on here, and I believe I have this. Let's see. I do. So there is an Apollo DevTools extension that you can get for Chrome, and that allows you to go into the cache, which you can see here, and you can see all of the data that's currently downloaded to the client. And you can see here I've got a few different cards that are downloaded. Let's see, can we find the one we're looking at? Let's see. Where are you? Oh, it's floating around here somewhere. But the point being that you can inspect your data that you're getting stored in the Apollo cache. And when we run our mutation, or after we run our mutation, we're going to run the votes query again, and we're going to update that local cache. And actually, we can see this in action now. So if I click this, that was just an update to the cache, as was that. So I'm not performing any funky React stuff. I'm not like just changing a state value and then updating the database in the background. That's actually triggered by the response that we're getting from GraphQL. So I click it, it goes to the server, does the change, and then sends that response back down to the client. We do a refetch, to say, okay, give us the latest data, and then we see that. And this is all happening within, a few milliseconds, so it's not like it's this belabored process. So with all of that said, now we need to go up and check out the server. So what we're going to do, I'm going to go ahead and close these out. So we're done with this. So we've got, actually, let's keep that open because that's going to come back up. Yeah, let's keep that open, and we're going to go to api.js. So this inside of pup is in the startup server directory. And this is loaded when the server starts up inside of pup. So it's saying load./API, which is literally the API.js file relative to the index.js. And this index.js is the entry point for the entire application, at least on the server side. So all of this stuff is being loaded for us. And the API.js file is where we define our GraphQL schema. And so if you're not familiar with GraphQL, the schema is how you define what type of data is available for querying, but also how you can manipulate data via mutations. So here I've got all the different queries that are in command, and then I've got all the different mutations that are in command. And we're not going to go too deep into that. If you're curious about GraphQL, definitely check out the Clever Beagle blog. Poke around, I think I'm going to say it's maybe 3 or 4 pages back, but there's a pretty good introductory tutorial on there about GraphQL and how it works, and it explains all this stuff in detail. And if you also look on YouTube, there's also some more Feature Fridays. I want to say, no, I don't want to say, because I'm going to, oh, no, I do remember. Okay, so if you look for the Feature Friday where we add a tags input to documents, I go pretty in depth on how GraphQL works in that video. So if you're looking for a deep dive on that, take a look at that video or take a look at that post on the site. So inside of our GraphQL schema, like I mentioned earlier, we have the concept of fields that we can query. So here I'm defining a field called votes. And you'll remember back on the client, we have a votes query. So votes here is identical to votes here. It's pointing at the same thing. So votes here is us defining it in the schema. This is us calling that field or requesting data from that field on the client. And then again, we're just saying down here, run the votes query when this component loads, or refetch that votes query after our mutation completes. So all of that is bumping back up to here in the API. So we're saying, taking that card ID that we got, and again, we have the ID scalar type, and you'll notice that what we define here, these are the variables that we're passing over from the client. So you'll notice whatever types I set here, those are going to be identical to the types that we set down here. So if I were to do something like this, notice we've got string exclamation point, ID exclamation point. If I left that as is and then tried to perform this query, it's going to fail because GraphQL is going to say, wait a minute. You're supposed to be passing an ID scalar type here, friend. You're not supposed to be passing a string. What's wrong with you? Pull yourself together. And then I'll say like, yeah, I know. I'm a piece of crap. That's a joke, by the way. I'm not sitting here like, yeah, I'm going to let the GraphQL schema beat me up. Hopefully somebody hears this and gets a chuckle out of that. So yeah, we have the ID scalar type here, and we have the same thing here. So those two have to match in order for this request to complete. And you may be wondering, what's the deal with the exclamation point? So that's saying that that is required. So if we don't pass a card ID variable, GraphQL is going to have a flip out. So make sure that we pass that. And really, that's the idea behind a lot of this stuff. It may seem excessive, but it's just a way to make sure that us as developers, when we're writing this code, we're actually considerate about the data that we're passing around, the type of that data, and just being generally responsible with what we're doing. Because in the past, it's been pretty easy to be flexible with that stuff. And usually when there's flexibility, you kind of make messes and cause trouble and cut corners and all that stuff. And it's not just me pointing at you saying like, yeah, straight up, kid. It's also me saying like, yeah, I've totally cut corners before because there wasn't a rigid system in place. So even though it looks burdensome when you see it, this is actually a great feature of GraphQL, is that it kind of gives you some guidelines, some sort of guardrails to bump into, so you're not, just causing reckless abandon inside of your API. So Votes query field. So when we say votes here, what we're saying is we're going to define on the root query. So again, we're not going to get too much into GraphQL concepts right here, but just know that votes here is matching votes here. So we're saying talk to the votes field in our schema. So what this is doing is defining the possibility of querying the votes field. But then if we go all the way down here, you can see we have this object called resolvers on our schema. I don't think I pointed it out. This whole friggin' object is called our schema. So that's made up of type defs, that's made up of resolvers, type defs and resolvers. And so type defs are saying, here's what's possible, and then resolvers are saying, here's how to resolve those possibilities. So in this case, we have query resolvers, and you can see here I'm using some funky dunky ES6 spread syntax. Don't let that spook you. I'll explain that in a sec. But what you'll notice is we have one of these called vote queries. And so if I zip up to the top of my file, I can see I'm importing vote queries from //API votes / queries. You got to get your joy where you can get it, folks. So we have the API directory, and then we're looking for votes, and then we're looking for queries. So even though GraphQL seems like this scary thing, at the end of the day, it's just a bunch of functions and some typing. It's not really that special. So, wow, that's probably going to upset somebody in San Francisco. My apologies. So, we have our resolver function for the votes field. So you'll notice votes here, this is going to become more and more familiar as you practice with it. So votes here is the same as, make sure we line this up, the votes here is the same as the votes here. So again, if I change this to pizza, I would then have to change this to pizza, and I would then have to change this to pizza. So that line is consistent throughout all of these different files. So whatever we're calling it in one place, except for weird circumstances, you're probably going to be calling it the exact same thing in all the other places that you're going to have to touch. So what we just pulled up is known as a resolver function. So here we only have one resolver function. You can see we export an object giving us the potential for multiple resolvers. But in the case of votes, we just have one. And so what we're doing is we're querying for votes. So we're trying to say we want to find all of the votes for the card ID passed in the arguments, or in this case variables. So this is kind of a weird convention in GraphQL. In all the examples, they call the variables that you send from the client args inside of your resolver. So args here is the same as this object here. Actually, I take that back. No, don't listen to me. Don't listen to me. That's our mutation. It's the same as the variables here. They look the same. Forgive me. So variables, this object here is the same as args here. So we can say args.cardID, and we're literally pointing at card ID, just like we see here, and then as well as on our refetch. So we've got variables here, same card ID here. So that spits out here inside of our resolver function, and that resolver function again is responsible for resolving our query. So our resolution, remember, if we go back to our votes GKL queries, is that we expect to get back account and current user has voted Boolean. And if we look at our query, or our resolver, what we're seeing is we get account back, we get an object with count back, and current user has voted. So we're getting votes.find. So inside of PUP, we rely on MongoDB, and more specifically, the framework that PUP is built on top of, Meteor. We rely on Meteor's MongoDB implementation to query. So if you work with just vanilla Node.js, or like the Node.js, what do you call those things? Not adapters. I guess it's an adapter. A database adapter. See, I should say it like I have like a New Jersey. It's like, oh, database adapter. You know what I'm talking about. It's a database adapter. You know, go get an Italian sandwich and play with your database adapter. Okay. So what you usually say is something like MongoDB query, and then this is a mess. It's like MongoDB collection. There you go. MongoDB collection. You'd say something like votes dot find like that. This is the exact same premise. The only difference is that we're using a built-in constructor that's in Meteor to simplify that process. So what I'm saying is find all of the votes in the votes collection in MongoDB and then give us back a count. So literally an integer value back for however many that you find. So if there's 5,000 votes for this card ID, we're going to get back 5,000 here. And then this one is saying, can you find any votes where the user ID is equal to context.user.id or underscore ID. So context here is just a meta object in GraphQL. It's basically the kitchen sink for your GraphQL server. And so like the name kind of implies, it allows you to add additional context to all of your queries. So inside of pup, one of the things that I do is I add the currently logged in user to the context object. So literally context.user here is the entire user object for whoever's currently logged into the application. And so what I'm doing is piggybacking on that context value and saying, give me that user's ID, their unique ID, so that when we vote, and we'll see this in a little bit when we look at the mutation, we can assign that user ID back to a vote. So this is kind of the other end of this where we're saying, okay, now that somebody has voted, we want to check and see if they actually have. So what we're doing is we're saying, look at the args.cardID on the vote and also see if there's a matching user. So if that comes back, and you'll notice what I'm doing here is I'm saying find that vote, but I don't really care about the vote, I care about the Boolean value. So I use this nice little trick, which is the double bang or double exclamation point, which is saying if this finds a value or it returns something, convert that to true, so Boolean true. If it doesn't find something or the value is undefined, convert that to a Boolean false. So this is a neat trick for dealing with whole values, but this way I don't have to say, oh, vote._ID exists or some nonsense like that. I can just say, hey, if that object comes back from the database, that's a true. If it doesn't, that's a false. Simple as that. So this is the bulk of our query. This is it. So all we're doing is we're saying return this object with count and current user has voted. And then back in our query, that's what we're defining here. And then all the way back inside of our component. And again, remember this query is running as soon as our component loads up in the browser, or in this case, when the view card component loads. So view card is rendering votes, or the votes component. So once that loads, then it's going to run the query. And the end result of that is, again, it's going to pass a data prop down to our component, and that data prop is going to contain data.votes, and that data.votes is equal to this object. So we'll notice we have data.votes.currentUser has voted, and again we're passing that has voted prop to our styled component so that we can trigger whether or not our text is blue or black. So black if you haven't voted, blue if you have voted. And then down here we've got if data.loading is false, we want to go ahead and render the number of votes that you've actually received for this card. So in this case, if data.votes.count, and again count here is the same as count here, is the same as count here. So whatever we return here is ultimately spitting out right here. So all of that said, we understand how the data is getting onto the screen, but what we haven't discussed is how it's getting into the database. So again, we have our mutation being loaded when our component loads, and we know that when we click on the component or click on the button, it's not really a button, but it looks like a button, so we're going to call it a button. When we click on that button, we're going to call the vote function. So again, vote here is coming from the name that we pass here. So again, if I change this to turkey, we're going to be calling the turkey function up here. Just the exact same thing. That's just us giving it a name that we understand. So in this case, remember, when we vote, we're doing an action. So we're saying we want to vote. We have a verb. We're voting. Democracy! We're voting. So what we're going to do is we call our mutation. And again, we pass a variables object. So that's the GraphQL part. So we're saying whatever goes in here, let me pull over our mutation file. So here we're saying we're going to pass a card ID as an ID scalar type. And if we go back up to our API, what we're going to see in the type mutation. So just like we have a root query where we define fields that we can query, we also have mutation fields. So in this case, vote is defining the possibility of calling the vote mutation. So we take in the card ID as an argument or as a variable, and we expect to return something representing or looking like, resembling, that's the word I was looking for, resembling the votes type. And so that we haven't really talked about. We'll wrap back around on that. That's a fussy GraphQL thing. But just know that fussy GraphQL thing means that it's defining explicitly that we're going to return an object with a count property equal to an integer, and current user has voted property equal to a Boolean value. And again, we'll wrap up with that. So right now, eyes on the prize, we're focused on defining our vote mutation field. So here we take in a card ID as an ID scalar type. And just like we saw before with our query, wouldn't you know it, if we go back to our API directory and then we look into votes and we go into mutations.js, well, hot diggity dog, look at that. We've also got an object being exported from our file with a single vote function. And you're probably thinking, don't turn it into pizza, you turned it into pizza. And yes, that's exactly the idea here. So vote here is the same as, I've lost us. It's the same as vote here, is the same as vote here, is the same as vote here. So all of those are the same. So now back in mutations, there's a little more logic going on. This is a little more squirrely in terms of what we're doing. So because I've designed this, and this is so at the beginning of this video I talked about, well, I'm going to explain why I did it this way. So one of the things I thought about is that I could have technically stored votes directly on the cards themselves. So in the cards collection, I could have just had a votes array on each card and stored like the user ID of the person who voted. But I realized that, and again, this is me being, oh, Mr. Hubris. But if a lot of people, happen to use this, well, I'm not going to want to store 10,000 user IDs on a card in my database. That's a lot of weight. And so what I decided was, well, why don't I just have a separate votes collection that references the card ID? And so every time a user votes, and this is where we start to look a little more closely at this. So what we're saying is, if there's not an existing vote by a user, we want to insert that vote with the card ID that they're voting for and their user ID. Again, the context object passed by pup to all of the resolvers in our GraphQL schema contains a user object, so we can pull our user ID off of there. So here I'm calling this query, but literally I'm using this to piggyback on two things. So first and foremost, if nobody has voted on this card before, this user, I should say, hasn't voted on this card before, we're going to pass that to votes.insert. And votes.insert is going to say, cool, I'm going to create a vote with this card ID and this user ID. And so now if we go and we query to see, has the current user voted right here, we're going to find out, yeah, they did. And conversely, we can see that we also check, because remember, our vote button is two-directional. So it's, if I haven't voted, I need to vote. If I have voted, I want to unvote. And so that's what this logic is doing. So if I haven't voted was handled by this case, where we insert an object with a card ID and the user ID. So that's part one. But then part two is, if I've already voted and I want to change my mind, we need to check, as developers, have they already voted? So what we're doing is we're looking for, querying for, a card ID or an object or a vote with a card ID of the card ID that was passed from the client and the user ID for the current user. And so if we find an existing vote, guess what we're going to do? We're going to snatch that out of there. We're going to say, we don't need that vote anymore. We're done with that thing. We're finished. All we care about is that you're happy, that your democracy is heard. And you said, I changed my mind. I don't want you to improve the handling of invoices and Stripe webhooks. I don't care. We hear you, so we're going to remove your vote. But if you change your mind, you're like, no, I'm just kidding, I do want that. We're going to go ahead and insert it. Simple as that. So down here, again, what we're doing is we're returning a value from our resolver. So remember back in our mutation file, I talked about returning a value no matter what. So this is us returning. So count and current user has voted here is identical to count and current user has voted here. So again, though, we don't really utilize those too much. There's probably a way for me to make this a little more efficient, but for the sake of clarity, I was kind of careless. So how about that? How about them apples? So yeah, that's our mutation. That's us changing the database. So back on the client then, we go ahead and we have our component. And so we call that mutation. And then immediately after, we rerun our query, our data updates, our cache updates, and our user is voting up and down on our card. How about that? And before I let you go, I do want to show you that type in GraphQL. So not to underwhelm, but that is the implementation. That's all, folks. But let's see that type, because I did promise I'd show it to you. So we're looking for, in the API directory, the votes directory, and then types.js. So we can see here type vote is containing a user ID, a card ID, and a created or excuse me, this is type vote. So this is a vote that we're retrieving from the database. So if I look back in API, somewhere around here, where is it? There we go. So when we're querying, we have a votes type returned. That votes type returns count and current user has voted. And then if we go back here and we look at our mutation, it's expected to return the same thing, but again, we're not utilizing it. And so types are just telling us, hey, this is the shape of the data that we're returning. And yes, GraphQL is that picky. It really wants you to tell it exactly what you're returning. And so if for some reason we change this to, yep, I'm going to do it, pizza. Or no, you know what, I'm not going to do it because I really enjoyed that New Jersey accent. I'm going to say, if we say Italian sandwich right here, okay? So we're going to say Italian sandwich is Boolean, okay? So if we do that, but then back in all of our queries, okay? Excuse me, got too much pastrami, you know, in my lungs. It's a real problem. My cardiologist isn't happy. Okay, so if I have Italian sandwich instead of current user has voted, that's going to really upset GraphQL. It's not going to be happy. Okay, I got to stop doing that. That kind of hurts. So that's the idea with types, is it's just explicitly stating, hey, here's the shape of the data that's coming back from our GraphQL schema. So with that, that is going to wrap up this Feature Friday. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, this one's pretty simple, but as you can see, this is one of my favorite parts about building products, is that what looks so simple actually does involve a lot of moving parts. So hopefully if you're just getting into this, that sets a better expectation for you, so you don't, you know, kind of walk in, you know, popping your suspenders like, oh, I'm going to finish this feature in 20 minutes. Which if you're experienced, you might be able to, but if you're new to the game, as you can see, there's a lot of parts that you need to know about that might slow you down a little bit. So hopefully that'll set the expectations so you're not, you know, overwhelmed or panicked when you're like, oh God, it's taking me like 3 weeks to implement this votes feature. That's okay. There are a lot of parts, so don't let it stress you out. So with that, I am going to go into my kitchen and I'm gonna try and put some deli meats together into a sandwich. Might put a little mustard on there. You know, I think my sister got me a marble rye. I don't have a sister, but I'm going to talk about a sister because I feel like Italian families are pretty big and there's usually a sister. You know, maybe she's involved with the bread business. You know, doesn't matter, but regardless, we just finished implementing a nice little votes feature for Feature Friday. So that's going to do it for us. If you haven't already, please make sure to go over to the YouTube channels and make sure you click that subscribe button, because that's going to help us out. It's going to let us know that you're interested. And also, if you're really interested, like you're really excited, like you're New York Jets fan, and oh my God, we're going to the Super Bowl. We're not, but you know, we can dream.
If you're really excited about that, you're gonna click on that bell icon, and it's gonna send you a notification as soon as we publish these videos. Like literally the second they happen, you're gonna get a little ding on the bell. Okay. Well, now that I've sat here and I've probably confused the hell out of a lot of you because my voice keeps changing just because I'm having fun, that's going to do it for Feature Friday, folks. So thanks for watching. Thanks for humoring my, my Italian character. And we will see you next week. Thanks for watching.